Summer is, without a doubt, the best season. That's a hill I'm willing to die on, and I will argue it any day. But my love for summer doesn't revolve around parties or late-night drinks as you might think. It's about nature, the outdoors, the warmth of the sun, and the sense of freedom that comes with it. When the heat arrives, you can bet I'm outside far more than I am inside. It was a hot June night a few years ago, back when I was around 17 or 18. Near my house, there's this enormous nature preserve called Ridgewood Forest, close to 1,000 acres, and even now, I'm pretty sure there are parts of it I've never set foot in. Two of my friends, Kyle and Dean, had planned a camping trip there one night. Technically, camping wasn't allowed there. It was actually illegal, but we figured it was such a vast forest that no one would catch us. All we had to do was venture deep enough into the woods, out of sight. Kyle was the wilderness expert among us, always ready with his survival knowledge, and Dean, well, he was the guy who brought the drinks. He couldn't stand being sober, especially not on a camping trip. We packed up Dean's car as the sun dipped below the horizon. The breeze was perfect, cool but not cold, just warm enough to promise a peaceful night outdoors. A few beers later, we were trudging through the dark forest with our camping gear. It was around 11:30 at night. I could already feel the alcohol settling in, making my head swim as we moved further into the woods. Thankfully, Kyle had brought his heavy-duty flashlight, so the darkness wasn't too much of an issue. But still, the deeper we went, the eerier the forest became. The trees seemed to close in on us, the shadows stretching farther in the dim light. After about half an hour of walking, we found a small clearing. It was the perfect spot to set up our tents. We followed Kyle's lead, pitching the tent and setting up our camp. Kyle then got to work on the fire, and within minutes, we had a decent blaze going, flickering and crackling in the quiet of the forest. Dean handed me another drink and set up his JBL speaker, filling the silence with some low music. We talked and drank, letting the fire warm us as we sat back, enjoying the night. After a couple of hours, the alcohol had taken hold of all of us. Dean turned down the music, starting to gather up the empty cans. Just then, a sharp, piercing whistle sliced through the quiet night, so loud it jolted me out of my chair. My heart started racing as I exchanged nervous glances with the others. We all froze, listening intently, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling in the leaves, not even the usual sounds of the forest. It was unnaturally quiet, too quiet. I replayed the sound in my head. It wasn't an animal call, that was for sure. It sounded more like a whistle you'd hear at a sports game, sharp, clear, and very deliberate. Kyle broke the silence, his voice low and tense, suggesting we pack up and leave. But Dean and I disagreed. We were deep in the woods, miles from any civilization, and the thought of running into whoever or whatever made that noise at this hour was terrifying. Kyle reasoned that whoever made the sound probably already knew we were here. That thought sent a chill down my spine. But leaving seemed risky too. We decided to wait it out, hoping it was just some prankster or an animal passing through. I went to put out the fire, but Kyle stopped me, reminding me that a fire could keep wild animals away. That's when the weight of our situation really hit me. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with something unknown lurking in the shadows. Minutes passed, and the three of us sat quietly, too on edge to sleep, barely talking. And then, out of nowhere, something flew through the air and landed directly in the fire. It sparked and popped. It was a firecracker. I screamed as it sizzled in the flames, and Kyle shot up, sprinting into the woods. Dean and I bolted after him, leaving everything behind in our panic. We ran blindly through the forest, Kyle's flashlight bouncing wildly as he dashed ahead. After what felt like forever, we finally stopped, breathless and terrified. We weren't being followed. At least, we didn't hear anyone chasing us, but we were far from safe. What had just happened? Who would throw a firecracker at us in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere? Dean was all for getting out of the woods and never looking back, but Kyle was hesitant to leave all his camping gear behind. He also pointed out that the fire was still going, and the last thing we needed was to accidentally start a forest fire. Reluctantly, I agreed to head back with him and check things out. Maybe it had all been a sick prank, and the person was long gone. Kyle, always the outdoorsman, was able to retrace our steps. As we neared the campsite, I could see the glow of the fire in the distance. But before we got any closer, Dean grabbed my arm, his face pale, and pointed towards the clearing. 3 figures were sitting in our chairs around the fire. They were completely still, as if frozen in place. My heart dropped. I could see the face of one of them, and it was horrifying. His mouth hung open, his expression lifeless, and the other 2 figures were just as motionless. I didn't know what to think. Were they real people? Why weren't they moving? We stood there, watching in horror, unable to understand what we were seeing. The silence was suffocating. Then, in the stillness, Dean accidentally kicked a rock, cursing under his breath. In an instant, the fire went out, snuffed as if someone had thrown a blanket over it. The speed at which it happened was unnatural. We didn't wait around to see what would happen next. We turned and ran for our lives, crashing through the trees as the sound of footsteps echoed behind us. This time, we were being followed. We didn't stop until we reached Dean's car. By some miracle, the footsteps behind us faded, and no one followed us out of the woods. None of us spoke on the ride back. We were too shaken, each lost in our thoughts, trying to process what had just happened. The next day, Kyle insisted on going back to retrieve his gear. Dean refused, but I agreed to go with Kyle, though I wasn't thrilled about it. When we got back to the campsite in the daylight, everything seemed normal, except for the smell. There was a sickening, rotting stench coming from Kyle's tent. He unzipped it, and inside we found a dead, decaying rat. The sight of it was enough to make me gag. I haven't been back to Ridgewood Forest since. This nightmare began about a month ago, but before I dive into the unsettling details, let me paint a picture of my life. I'm 24 years old, still living at home with my parents, which, admittedly, isn't ideal. My family has always struggled financially, and it's a burden I carry with me every day. Most of my income goes towards helping pay bills, leaving me little room to breathe. My relationship with my parents is strained at best. Arguments are frequent, and when I'm not at work or out with friends, I keep to myself, retreating into my own space to avoid the constant tension. Growing up was hard. I don't want to dwell on it or play the victim, but it wasn't easy. The one thing I always turned to, my saving grace, was fitness. Working out gave me a sense of control, a way to escape the suffocating stress and frustration that seemed to follow me everywhere. It was my healthy coping mechanism, a way to vent my anger, my stress, without hurting anyone else. There's a park about 10 minutes away from my house, on top of a hill that overlooks the city. It's a quiet, somewhat secluded place with basic workout equipment, pull-up bars, dip bars, that kind of thing. I love going there, especially at night. During the day, it gets crowded, but at night, it's almost always deserted, peaceful. That's when I can really clear my head. One night, after a particularly nasty argument with my parents, I felt like I had to get out of the house. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and the heat was stifling. The kind of humid summer night where even the air feels thick, almost suffocating. I stepped outside and breathed in the heavy, warm air, hoping it would cool my boiling frustration. Our driveway was dark, lit only by a flickering street lamp a few houses down. My old, beat-up Corolla sat there like always, a relic from a better time. I climbed in, started the engine, and rolled down the windows, letting the warm breeze whip through my hair as I drove to the park. The city was quiet at this hour, the streets nearly empty, and the park completely deserted. It was the perfect escape. The view from the top of the hill, with the city lights twinkling far below, always helped me feel a little more grounded. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed mine was the only car there. A small wave of relief washed over me. I needed this, some time alone, away from everything and everyone. I started my workout routine like I always do, beginning with pull-ups. I don't count reps. I just go until my muscles can't take it anymore, then rest and repeat. I was midway through a set, the familiar burns spreading through my arms, when something strange happened. I felt it before I saw anything. A shift in the air, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. Instinctively, I let go of the bar and turned around. He was standing less than a foot away from me. A man, tall, with a haggard, unkempt look about him. His clothes were dirty and torn in places, his hair matted and wild. But what scared me the most was how close he was. So close I could smell him, the sour stench of sweat and grime. I let out a startled yelp and jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't seem fazed by my reaction. Instead, he laughed. It was a strange, guttural sound, as if he hadn't laughed in years. He apologized, saying he didn't mean to frighten me, but there was something off about the way he said it. Something too casual, too comfortable for someone who had just invaded my personal space. I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us, and asked, "Why were you standing so close?" He smiled, a crooked, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I live here," he said. "I see you working out all the time." That stopped me in my tracks. He had been watching me regularly. I hadn't noticed anyone before, but then again, I never thought to look. My mind raced, trying to piece together how long he had been lurking in the shadows, watching my every move. The thought made my skin crawl. I tried to remain calm. I've never been a confrontational person, and in that moment, I just wanted to get through my workout and leave without making a scene. I awkwardly told him I was just going to finish my set and head out. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me with those wide, unsettling eyes. I hopped back on the pull-up bar, trying to ignore the fact that he was still standing there, watching. I could feel his gaze burning into my back, making it impossible to focus. My muscles were trembling from both the workout and the sheer unease I felt. And then, just as I was about to finish my set, I heard him say something that made my blood run cold. He whispered my full name. My heart stopped. I froze, hanging there for a moment before dropping to the ground. I turned to face him, my voice shaky. "What did you just say?" He didn't respond, just stared at me with that same crazed grin. His eyes were wide, unblinking. A wave of nausea rolled over me. How did he know my name? Had he been following me longer than I realized? My gut screamed at me to leave now. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off him, and without another word, I started walking quickly to my car. The entire time, I felt his eyes on me, watching my every step. I reached my car, unlocked it with trembling hands, and threw myself inside. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting him to be chasing after me. But no, he was still there, standing under the streetlight, staring at me. Before I rounded the corner, I saw him grab the pull-up bar and try to mimic what I had been doing. It was as if he wanted to be me, to take my place. I sped out of the park, not looking back again. The next morning, I tried to push the memory of that night out of my mind, convincing myself that maybe I had overreacted. Maybe it was just some harmless weirdo. But then something happened that made me realize this was far from over. I left for work early, as I always do, before my parents were even awake. As I opened the front door, I noticed an unmarked envelope sitting on the doorstep. It was addressed to me. I didn't think much of it at first, just assumed it was some junk mail, but I tossed it into my bag and went on my way. Later, during my lunch break, I sat in my car, eating a sandwich I had packed that morning. I remembered the envelope and pulled it out of my bag. My heart was racing for some reason, a sense of dread creeping over me. I tore it open and pulled out a stack of photos. My hands shook as I flipped through them. Every single photo was of me. One was of me sitting in my car. Another was of me at work. Another, taken at the park, showed me mid-pull-up, unaware I was being watched. My stomach dropped. There were more photos, pictures of my house, pictures of me walking down the street, and the worst one of all, me sleeping, taken from outside my bedroom window. I felt like I was going to throw up. Tears welled up in my eyes as I stared at the photos in disbelief. I knew who had taken them. It had to be him, the man from the park. But how long had he been following me? How had he found out where I lived? I didn't finish my lunch. I drove straight to the police station, the photos clutched in my hand. My voice was shaking as I explained everything. The man at the park, the photos, the way he seemed to know everything about me. The police listened, but I could tell they weren't entirely convinced. They said they'd open an investigation, but I could tell they didn't have much to go on. After that, things only got worse. A few nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of knocking. It wasn't loud, just a soft, persistent tap at the door. I didn't answer. I didn't even move. I just lay there, paralyzed with fear, until the knocking stopped. The next day, I found a sticky note on my car window with a heart drawn in red Sharpie. It was mocking, almost playful, and it sent chills down my spine. I went back to the police, desperate for help, but without any solid evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They said they would open a stalker investigation, but it felt like an empty promise. Now, a month later, I'm living in constant fear. My parents are trying to find a new place for us to live, but with our financial situation, it's difficult. Every night, I double-check the locks on my windows and doors, and I lie awake, listening for the faintest sound. I'm terrified to even leave the house. The worst part is, I haven't heard from the police since I last reported the incidents. It feels like I'm trapped, with no way out. And every night, I sleep with one eye open, waiting for the next. Last year, something happened that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I was 20 years old, and honestly, I wasn't the type of person who went out much. Most of the time, if I did end up at any social event, it was because my irresponsible friends somehow managed to drag me along. That particular night was one of those times. My friend Andrew had invited me to a party at around 10 p.m. It was a last-minute invite, and since I didn't have anything better to do, I reluctantly agreed. I knew if I said no, he'd pester me about it for weeks. Andrew lived a few towns over, so we figured it was easier to drive separately. As soon as I turned onto the street where the party was, I got a text from Andrew. He bailed on me at the last second. I was furious. How could he do that to me? I'd driven all this way, and now I was sitting outside a stranger's house, feeling like an absolute idiot. But after spending all that time driving, I wasn't about to just head home. I figured I might as well go in and see what the night had in store. When I knocked on the door, the host, Ethan, answered with a wide smile. He was instantly likable, one of those people who can make anyone feel welcome. I was nervous about being the odd one out, but he introduced me around, and everyone was surprisingly friendly. It didn't take long before I started to relax. Even though I didn't know a single person there, I grabbed a drink and decided to enjoy myself. As the night wore on, things were going pretty well. People were laughing, music was playing, and I was feeling less awkward than I usually did at parties. But I wasn't keeping track of how much I was drinking. By around 1 a.m., the party was still in full swing, but I had definitely gone overboard with the booze. I started to feel dizzy and nauseous, and I needed to get away for a minute to collect myself. I stumbled upstairs, hoping to find a bathroom, but of course, all of them were occupied. In my drunken state, I started wandering around the upper floors of the house, which turned out to be way bigger than it looked from the outside. After what felt like forever, I came across a small door that seemed to lead up to an attic. Desperate for some peace and quiet, I slipped inside. It was dark, dusty, and definitely not part of the house that anyone else was using. The air was heavy with the smell of old wood, and the floorboards creaked under my feet. I noticed a small window in the corner of the attic, and I hurried over to open it. The cool night air hit me, and I leaned out the window, taking deep breaths, trying to clear my head. For a moment, I thought I might throw up, but the breeze helped settle my stomach. Just as I was starting to feel a bit better, I heard something strange. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps on the roof. My heart started pounding. What could that be? There was no reason for anyone to be on the roof, especially not at this hour. I froze, listening closely, hoping I had imagined it. But no, there it was again, soft, deliberate footsteps. My curiosity got the better of me, and against all logic, I climbed out the window onto the roof. I was drunk, and there's no way I would have done something that reckless if I had been sober, but in that moment, I just had to know what was going on. The moonlight was bright enough that I could see the outlines of two figures, both wearing masks and carrying large bags. My stomach dropped. It took me a second to realize what I was seeing, but then it hit me. Ethan's house was being robbed. I stood there in shock, not knowing what to do. Should I yell for help? What if they were armed? My mind was racing, and before I could make a decision, I accidentally kicked a loose shingle. The sound was loud enough to catch their attention. One of the burglars turned his head sharply in my direction. Our eyes met for a brief second, and in that moment, fear gripped me. He nudged his partner, and the two of them started moving quickly across the roof. My heart was pounding, but a surge of adrenaline pushed me into action. I couldn't let them get away, not after how kind Ethan had been to me. I started following them, keeping a distance, but trying not to lose sight of them. They were heading toward the far edge of the roof, where it sloped down toward the backyard. I figured they were planning their escape. I reached for my phone, but in my drunken state, I fumbled it. It slipped out of my hands and hit the roof with a loud clatter. The noise was enough to make the burglars stop. One of them turned and hissed, "Who's there?" Panic set in. I had to act fast. I spotted a loose roof tile nearby, and without thinking, I picked it up and threw it at them. The tile missed, but it startled them. One of the burglars lost his footing and slipped down the roof, crashing into the gutter and then falling to the ground below with a sickening thud. The other burglar, now in a full-blown panic, jumped onto a nearby tree and scrambled down, disappearing into the shadows. I rushed to the edge of the roof and looked down. The burglar who had fallen was lying on the ground, groaning in pain. I didn't know if he was seriously hurt or not, but I knew I had to get help. As I turned to climb back into the attic, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Someone must have already called the police. I scrambled back inside, making my way downstairs, trying to stay calm. When I reached the party, everything was still going as if nothing had happened. People were dancing, drinking, and laughing, completely unaware of the drama unfolding just outside. I found Ethan and pulled him aside. "You need to call the police," I said, my voice shaking. "Your house is being robbed. I saw them on the roof." Ethan's face went pale. He quickly called the cops, and as I explained what had happened, the party's atmosphere shifted. People started whispering, and the music was turned off. Apparently, one of Ethan's neighbors had already called the police earlier due to a noise complaint, which turned out to be a stroke of luck. The officers arrived within minutes. When they got there, I led them to the injured burglar, who was arrested right there in the backyard. His partner had gotten away, though, vanishing into the night. The party ended abruptly, with everyone leaving in a hurry. Ethan thanked me over and over, still in disbelief that his house had been the target of a robbery while he was hosting a party. A few months later, I was hanging out at my friend Luke's place when Ethan called and invited us over for drinks. When we got to his house, I immediately noticed something different. The front door and windows had all been replaced with heavy-duty ones. The warm, inviting look of the house was gone, replaced by reinforced steel and thick glass. As we sat in his basement, playing pool and having beers, Ethan told us something that left me feeling cold. After the robbery, his family started receiving threatening letters. Some of them had pictures of his family members taken from a distance. They reported it to the police, but there were no leads. A few weeks after the letters started, Ethan's mum noticed a strange car circling their house late at night. Things got even creepier when Ethan's dad discovered that their backyard had been tampered with. Things moved around, items missing. It was clear someone had been snooping around. In response, Ethan's parents went all out with security. They installed cameras all over the house, reinforced the doors and windows, and even put up a fence around the yard. But despite their efforts, the police still hadn't caught the second burglar, and the threats hadn't completely stopped. Ethan's family was living in fear, not knowing if or when the criminal would strike again. With summer approaching, I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over yet. I've never felt fear quite like that night on the roof, and now I realize how serious the situation really was. Something tells me this isn't the last time I'll hear from Ethan about it.